I was a geology major in college. And as wonderful as it is to look at rocks in textbooks and laboratories, really the place that one learns geology is outdoors, where there are rocks. So geology majors go on a lot of field trips. I was taking a class in stratigraphy. That's the study of how different layers of rocks and the ways in which they bend and arc into one another tell us the story of geological history. We're out in the Mojave. Our teacher has the class standing facing a large rock formation, and she's pointing out the different layers of rock. Now, they're all brown, but they are distinguishable. You can see stripes. This one's reddish brown, that one's yellow brown, this one's dark brown. And she's lecturing for 5 minutes or so, and one of the students raises her hand and says, "Professor, I'm so sorry. I don't see what you're talking about. I don't see any stripes in the rocks." The teacher takes a look at the student. She walks over to her, removes her sunglasses, and says, "Look again." And it was a miracle. She could see the stripes in the rocks. That is a story about perspective, how we perceive what we're seeing in the world. And so is this week's story about the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. So I'm going to walk you through Pharaoh's perspective on the pillars, the nations of the world's perspective on the pillars, Israel's perspective on the pillars, and God's own perspective on the pillars. And my argument is that through the evolution of a human life, as we grow spiritually, hopefully our perspective will become more and more like God's. Let's start with Pharaoh. The Malbim says, it's interesting that the phrase is used, the pillars were seen day and night. What did Pharaoh conclude from seeing these pillars day and night? That the Israelites are lost. He sees the cloud during the day and the fire during the night, and it's going back and forth, and they don't seem to be getting anywhere. And Pharaoh says, "Aha, they've gotten lost. God has abandoned them. I should pursue them and recapture them. That's what I'm going to do." Kind of makes sense. That's what tyrants do. Chizkuni, on the other hand, says, when Pharaoh has his final audience with Moses and says, "Go and worship in the desert," he never actually says, "I let your people go." It's a true story. You can look it up, chapter 12, verse 32. Pharaoh never actually says, "I'm letting you go." And so when he sees the pillar of cloud, he says, okay, God is leading them to the spot where they will worship God. But when he sees the pillar of fire, Pharaoh says, wait a minute. They're still walking into the night? No. They're not coming back. And he does what a tyrant does. He pursues to kill and to recapture. That's Pharaoh's perspective. The nations of the world tell a different story. The Bechor Shur says something a little cryptic. He says they see that the king walked before the people with the light. Thanks, Bechor Shur. He's pulling, of course, from an older midrash, as the commentators often do. So I looked it up. The version I found was in Avodah Zarah. It's a piece of the Talmud, and it's kind of an amusing story. There is a Roman official who converted to Judaism. So his boss says, "Oh, we can't have that. He was a great employee. We need him back." He sends a friend to go and convince him, "Stop being Jewish, come back to Rome." Well, a few days later, the friend isn't back. So the boss sends yet another of his ministers. This guy doesn't come back either. "All right," says the boss, "I've got to figure out what's going on." He finds his 3 employees and he says, "What's up with you? Why are you hanging out with the Jews? You don't want to be Jewish. Come back, be part of Rome. We're the biggest empire in the world. We have health benefits." And what they say to their boss is, "Look, what the Jews have is a really amazing God. Because," and they make a parable for him, A king of flesh and blood, when he comes down from his throne, expects his servants to carry torches in front of him. But the Jewish God, he bears the torch for his people. So I learned from this that what is the perspective of the pillars of the nations of the world? That it's the signs and the wonders that God promised to show. That God is a compassionate God, that God helps in a time of turmoil and trouble. The perspective of the Israelites, you heard me say, or perhaps you heard me say in the Torah introduction, but in case you didn't, I'll repeat it. There were two pillars. The pillar of cloud had a job to literally raise the ground, or lift it up if it was a valley. Because think about the people who are leaving Egypt. It's not just able-bodied people. There are people who are infirm, there are children, there are pregnant women, there are people who are disabled. They need the way made smoother. And then the pillar of fire at night, there's a lot said about it. Some say it kept the wild animals away. Others say it kept them warm because the desert temperatures plummet at night. And then, too, in this time of pressing danger, when they're not very far from Egypt, and we know what Pharaoh's perspective was on these pillars, it allows them to keep walking at night. But what is God's perspective on the pillar? That came up in the Mechilta, which is an early collection of Midrash, and it starts by posing an interesting question, which is, how did the Israelites see the pillar at all when the world is full of God's glory? In other words, going back to Joe's fish analogy last night, when you're a fish and you're swimming in water, how can you distinguish one piece of water from another? What is so miraculous about a pillar? I mean, my opposable thumbs are pretty miraculous. When I look at my lawn and I only planted 2 species of grass and now there are 14 green things growing there, that's miraculous that they thrive. God's perspective is, Melo kol haaretz kvodo, the whole world is full of God's glory. The Ber Maim Chaim, a Hasidic master, talks a little bit about this ability to have the perspective of unity and the whole world being God and God being the whole world. And here's what the Ber Maim Chaim points out. In our chapter, near the beginning of Exodus, okay, maybe the middle of Exodus, we are told there are 2 distinct pillars. There was a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. But at the end of the book of Exodus, when it's talking about they would fold up the tent when the pillar lifted itself, there's only one pillar. It gets referred to there as the pillar that was fire by day and fire by night. It becomes one. So, says the Ber Maim Chaim, what happened? When Israel built the Mishkan, which happens in between fleeing Egypt and the end of the book of Exodus, when they built the tabernacle, that was the space where humanity and divinity could dwell together, where heaven and earth could touch and be unified. And in that experience, God was able to show the Israelites it's all one thing. I started this story about the sunglasses, my friend who needed a little help to see that there were actually these marvelous striations of different shades of brown. It wasn't all one blob. When we shift our perspective, we come to see the world differently. As did the prophet Ezekiel, who gave us that quote that we put in all of our Amidas, right? Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech La'aretz Kavodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts who fills the earth with God's glory. When I teach this theology of Ezekiel's in class, inevitably I have a student that stands up and says, but Rabbi, I mean, come on. There's God's glory in there's God's glory in a thumbtack. Really, Rabbi? And I say, you know what, you're right. Any theology stretched to its limits becomes a little entertaining. But what if the point is to walk through life as if God were in a thumbtack? And come to think of it, opposable thumbs are miraculous, and the thumbtack is, a product of having those opposable thumbs. So maybe there's a little bit of divinity in a thumbtack too. So I'll leave you with a spiritual question. What do you need, and what would it be like to walk through life seeing God in everything? Shabbat Shalom.